this is Run Life Repeat. This is episode number 8, and we are speaking to Professor Tim Noakes, who is a South African scientist and an emeritus professor in the Division of Exercise Science and Sport Medicine at the University of Cape Town. He is the co-founder of the now prestigious Sports Science Institute of South Africa. He's been rated an A1 scientist by the National Research Foundation of South Africa for a third 5-year term. In 2008, he received the Order of Mapungubwe Silver from the President of South Africa for excellent contribution in the field of sport and science of physical exercise. Professor Noakes has published more than 750 scientific books and articles. He is now the co-founder and chief medical director of the Nutrition Network and devotes a majority of his time to promoting the low carbohydrate, high fat diet and on raising funds for Eat Better South Africa and reaching research through the Tim Noakes Foundation. Professor Noakes, welcome.
Thanks, Karina. Lovely to be with you both. Thank you.
You are trained as a medical doctor, but in South Africa, you are mostly known as a sports scientist and professor. Would you share with us when your interest in studying the science behind sport and nutrition originated?
Yes, Karina, I think it's quite simple. I went to medical school without really knowing what I wanted to do. And within the first year, I started rowing as a young student. And I became captivated with the biology of human movement and exercise science. And one day we had the coach from the Olympic team in Britain, the rowing team, came out to us and gave a lecture to us. And I remember him going up to the blackboard and drawing a graph. And the graph showed on the bottom was how far you'd rowed from 0 to 2,000 meters. And on the y-axis was the level of your blood lactate level. And so he drew this curve like that. And he said, that's why you feel so terrible at 1,000 meters, because your lactic acid level is so high. And I remember going and thinking, gosh, you mean you can study these things? And I decided at that moment that I was going to study sports science. So although I was a medical student, I decided it's not going to be medicine, I don't think. So the interesting thing was I went into to study science, and I studied the science of sport right through that was my major focus up till December 2010. And then I had this Damascene moment when I discovered that my own ill health had been caused by the diet I was eating, and that I thought I could just not worry about my future health. As long as I was running marathons and lots of exercise, I'd be healthy. And I discovered that that wasn't the case. And I converted to the low carb diet in December 2010. And that changed my life dramatically, as many people know, because I got essentially thrown out of my university and my profession for speaking the truth about the diet. And so that put me on another direction, which I've been following for the last 10 years. And I haven't regretted a moment of it. It's been very tough, but I at least discovered the truth about nutrition.
Professor, you've got a hypothesis of how the brain may play a more important role in race potential than runners have typically considered. Would you tell us more about what you call the central governor theory of fatigue?
Yes, Liesl. So when I started, and as I've shown you the example I showed you, the coach, the Olympic coach, told us, it's lactic acid that's causing fatigue. And that's a theory that was developed in the 1922 or 23 by a guy called A.V. Hill, who won a Nobel Prize, not for that, but for other work. And we call that the A.V. Hill cardiovascular anaerobic model. And that model holds that as you exercise more vigorously, ultimately your muscles run out of oxygen. You can't pump enough blood to the muscles. They become so-called anaerobic and they produce lactic acid. And then the lactic acid stops you from exercising. And that's an interesting model because the brain has no role. It doesn't matter what you think. Once that happens, your muscles essentially are poison, so you have to stop. And I became interested in this because in our very early research in our Sports Science Institute in the 1980s, we had fairly basic equipment. And we were told that when you put someone on a treadmill and make them run faster and faster and faster, their oxygen consumption goes up and up, and then it plateaus. It's so-called plateaus. It doesn't go any higher. And so we studied athletes, and I studied some really good athletes, the best athletes we had in Cape Town, and we almost never could see this so-called plateau. So, but it was really interesting because if at that time you published a paper on this test, you had to say, we measured a plateau in 100% of athletes. And if you didn't say that, your paper wouldn't be published because they'd said, but you didn't push the guy hard enough to reach this plateau. And so I realized that you either lie or you tell the truth. So we told the truth. We said we didn't find the plateau in something like 80% of people. So in that 80% of people, they weren't limited by oxygen delivery to the muscles. So it seemed to me that the lactic acid model didn't work. So in 1996, I was asked to give a very prestigious lecture. And by this time I was a generalist, and I thought, why don't I look at the flaws in sports science that we teach and for which there isn't much evidence? And I spoke about this plateau phenomenon, and I proposed that it's not due to oxygen limitations. There's something else going on in the muscle. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't lactic acid and it wasn't oxygen deficiency. I was then challenged, because this was such a contradictory idea, a controversial idea, I should perhaps say. I was challenged by some of the leading biologists and physiologists in North America, and they wrote this long article saying why I was wrong. So I decided, well, okay, of course I've got to respond. And when I did that, I went back and read A.V. Hill's work. And I discovered this is now the 1920s work, which people had forgotten. And he used the word of a governor, because what he thought was actually happening was that the heart was running out of oxygen. And he said there has to be a governor to prevent the heart from running out of oxygen, and that's why you stop. But he didn't know where the governor was, whether it was in the brain or in the heart itself. And that was it. That was literally the one paragraph in everything he wrote. He wrote about the governor. And as soon as I read it, I knew exactly what it was, because my training was also in cardiology, and I knew that if you want to protect the heart, you don't slow the heart down, you slow the body down so that you can't run faster. That's the way you protect the heart, because we do that all the time in medicine. If we want to protect your heart, we make sure that the rest of your body slows down, so you're not exercising, for example. So immediately I knew that the governor is in the brain and it prevents the muscles from working. So I worked out the central governor model and then presented that argument probably quite fully already in the 2000. And then we wrote a series of articles in 2004, 2005, which laid down all the evidence for why this is. And we were able to show, we were able to do studies to show that it has to be correct. And the very simple answer is, when you are sprinting near the end of a marathon or going up a hill in a cycle tour, and you feel absolutely exhausted and you think, I can't go any faster. If we measure how much muscle is actually being activated in your legs, we found it's between 30 and 60% of your muscle mass. So 40% is not being used. So although you feel like you are doing everything possible to go as fast as you possibly can, you're still being restricted to use only 60% of your muscle mass. And that's because the brain says, no, you can't use 65% or 70%, because if you do, something will go wrong. So that's the basis for the model. The model is that the brain is there to protect you. It works out. You tell them, okay, today I'm running 10 Ks and it's a race. It says, fine, 10 Ks, is it hot? What's your condition? Are you well rested? And then we'll allow you to start the race at that pace, because we can get you to the finish in a healthy state. Similarly, if you run the Comrades, it says, okay, you're going to run 90 kilometers today. It's going to be hotter in the afternoon, blah, blah, blah. And it makes all these calculations. and it says this is the pace that you're going to start at, and we're going to slow you down later on as it gets hotter. And you can try all you like to go faster in the second half of the Comrades, but it ain't going to happen, because if you go faster, something else is going to happen. You're not going to reach the finish. So that's how the model works. And I think it's pretty established now that it is. I mean, logically, it's obvious, but it takes someone to see what is obvious.
So is it possible, you say that you use 60% of your potential and then your brain stops you. So is it possible to ignore that part of your brain and use 80 or 90 or 100%?
Only if you were being chased and your life depended on it. So in other words, if there was an immediate threat to your life, and I mean, we've seen this, we've seen in people running away from, let's say they're in a war situation, and they're being chased by the opponents, and they know that if they're caught, they'll be shot. Then you'll run to your death. But that's about the only one. Otherwise, the controls are, unfortunately, they're very strong. But the implication is that the athlete chooses the outcome. And that's difficult for people to understand, that in fact, the winner chooses to win, and the second guy chooses to come second, or the second lady chooses to come second, because we call it the stopping wish. There comes a point, let's say you get to 65 Ks in the Comrades, and now you've got 25 Ks to go or so. You make a decision, how much is it worth for you to take the other 25 kilometers of discomfort? How much is it worth to you? Is it worth winning the race, or coming second or third, or making a silver medal or not making a silver medal? And that's when you hit the wall. People hit the wall not because they've run out of energy, but because they make a decision it's not worth it any longer. And they slow down, and there's no way you can reverse that. Once you make that decision, you will only keep that pace to the finish. So that's the reality, and we kind of don't really investigate it as well as we should. I know about this because my most recent PhD student has come up with this model and has worked out that ultimately the decision is the stopping wish, or when are you going to say, okay, I don't care how much it hurts, I'm going to win this race, or the pain is too much, the discomfort is too much, it's not really worth it any further, I'm going to slack off, and I don't mind that I come second or third.
Yeah. That is actually such a powerful thing. And I think that is where we start seeing all of these mental preparation and coaching also becoming part of people's training. Because I think that is, we often say to people, if you can run 5 kilos, you can run 10 kilos. If you can do 10, you can do 21. And if you can do that, you can actually do 42. And I think it is that whole thing of not really understanding and appreciating the mental part of what is happening in the midst of that.
No, absolutely. And I think that, you know, the athletes who are ultimately the world champions, they don't have the limitations that the rest of us have. They don't see it as a limitation. And it's something that always interests me, is how can people do things that for most of us would say, well, that's utterly impossible, I won't even try it. Yeah. You know, I remember one of South Africa's top triathletes, and I can't remember his name, but he was a high school student in Pretoria. And one day he read that there was a marathon in Pretoria, like in a week's time. So he said, oh, well, let's go and run it. So he literally went and ran it. He ran the marathon without any training and finished it. And he said, oh, we finished the marathon, now let's do the Comrades. And, you know, with a couple of weeks training, he went and finished the Comrades. And then he became a brilliant triathlete. And that's just not normal. That's completely the extreme example. And I think that the great athletes that I've had the privilege to work with, their careers are always like that. They never understood the limitations that the rest of us put on ourselves. They had such belief in themselves. One of my great friends is a guy called Oscar Chulipski, and I tell this story because people really laugh at it. He became astonishing, and he won 12 times. He won the race, the Molokai Challenge in Hawaii, where he was competing against Olympic champions, and he was 40 and he was still winning it. And these guys were 22, 23. So I first met him when he was racing in a race between Port Elizabeth and East London. It's a canoeing, a kayaking race. And he was 18 years old. And on the first evening, we all got together and were given instructions of what's going to happen and so on. We were doing medical research on the athletes. And at the end of the discussions, he got up as an 18-year-old and he said, guys, I just want to tell you, you're all competing for second place. I'm going to win this race. And they were the best canoeists, the best paddlers in South Africa. And of course, he won the race by miles. And he never stopped. He never stopped winning. And so he was an exception, but that's the sort of attitude that these guys have and which puts them apart. So, you know, if he gets passed in a race, he gets angry. He doesn't think, gosh, you know, I'm tired. No, it's why are you going ahead of me? I'm going to not beat you. That's a different attitude.
I love actually looking at the different attitudes people have in life, because sometimes we just need to pause and get to that place where we say, and actually start doing the introspection of what am I thinking and where is my thinking taking me? But Professor Noakes, you have written so many articles and done some amazing work, but you've also written the book Waterlogged about the dangers of hypernatremia. Would you elaborate on what causes this condition? Why is it so dangerous? And give us some hydration guidelines for training and competition.
Yeah, so this is another of the myths. So when I started in 1969, so I went to medical school in 1969, and in that year, two of the world authorities from Johannesburg, guys called Wyndham and Stratham, who had saved, no, they hadn't quite saved the mining industry, but pretty much so, because heat stroke was a massive problem in the mines, the deep mines. The mines in South Africa are deepest in the world. And as you go deeper, the surface temperature gets hotter and hotter. The rock face gets up to 50 degrees centigrade. And heat stroke became a big problem amongst the miners early on because people didn't understand it. And so Wyndham and Stratham did some of the most remarkable research and managed to bring the heat stroke rates right down to almost nothing. Their problem was they thought that because they understood mining, that they could go and look at marathon running. So they did a study in 1968. And the study really was to determine whether sugar, if you add more sugar to your food for a week before the marathon, whether you could run faster. And ironically, they actually did find that the people who added the sugar did a bit better. It's not something I like to advertise, but given that sugar is not the most healthy food for you. Anyway, so they did find that, but then as a part of the other study, which they hadn't really set out to study, and that's important in science, you have to plan ahead. They looked retrospectively, they had some data, they'd measured how much weight these people had lost during the race, and they measured their body temperatures at the finish. And they found that those who had lost the most weight, i.e. were the most dehydrated, had the highest body temperatures. And they then assumed causation. They assumed that because you'd become dehydrated, that had caused your body temperature to be elevated. But association like that doesn't mean causation. And the point they missed was that the fastest runners drank the least, sweated the most, and became the most dehydrated. And the reason they had high temperatures wasn't because they were dehydrated, it was because they were running faster. But this was now taken as gospel. And the article title was The Dangers of an Inadequate Water Intake During Marathon Running. So when I read this, now expert, I've become the expert overnight. And I started writing columns and the first column I ever wrote was for the Germiston Callies Athletics Club. It went in the Corky Memorial, sort of the brochure for the race. And I think it was like 73, 74, around about there. And there it says, Wyndham and Stratham, the two greatest scientists in the history of medicine, said that if you become dehydrated, you're going to kill yourself. So Noakes was saying, you've got to drink more and so on. What was interesting at the time, we weren't allowed to drink during marathons. You could only drink after like 15 miles or something, and then you could drink occasionally. And there was no provision of fluids. You had to provide your own fluids. And so I wrote extensively about how dangerous this was and we're going to kill everyone. The fact that no one was dying was kind of missed. So anyway, I was right out there. And I remember writing an article in 1981 saying that you must drink as much as you possibly can during races. And if you can't drink it, you must put it over your body and so on. So that was the background. Then in the first week of June 1981, I received a letter from a 46-year-old lady in Johannesburg. And she described what had happened to her during the 1981 Comrades Marathon. And that was the first race where fluid was provided every mile. The first time in South Africa, in any race, that you could get a drink every mile. Because now we'd gone on people like my advice, you can't drink enough. So that we were providing water every mile in the race. So they're 56 miles, you got 56 stations. It's a great opportunity to drink plenty and you're not paying for it. There's nowhere else in history can you get access to so much fluid. Anyway, the point was that at 70 kilometers, she didn't recognize her husband. He figured that wasn't a good sign. So he took her out of the race and took her to the finish at the Comrades in Pietermaritzburg, where she was given 2 liters of fluid intravenously because obviously she's dehydrated. The problem was she got worse and she went unconscious and had a fit. So he figured maybe this is not what I should be treating. So he took her to hospital, to Addington Hospital in Durban, where she was fortunately seen by a clinician who treated her as a patient, not the fact that she'd been running a marathon and therefore he had bias to think that she'd be dehydrated. He treated her as if she had come to hospital and he wanted to work out why she was unconscious. And one of the things he measured was her blood sodium concentration, and it was extremely low. Normally you maintain the blood sodium at about 140 millimoles per liter. She was at 110. Now it's impossible to get that value. It's just not, you can't do it. So we were challenged by what had happened. And she wrote to me and she said, "Doc, what happened?" I said, "I've no idea, absolutely no clue." But that inspired me to start looking around. And it turned out there were 3 other athletes in that race who'd suffered minor problems. They'd been in hospital, but they weren't as sick as she was. And eventually there was a lady who I knew very well, and she competed in the Durban Triathlon. And in the final marathon, she had to walk after about 10 kilometers. And she was a really good athlete. She should have won the race. And she said, "I couldn't breathe. I was coughing and I was short of breath." And she said, "I put on 4 kilograms during the race." And I said, "But how do you know?" Well, she said, "I weighed myself," because she had an eating disorder and she was really interested in what her weight was. And she said, "I put on 4 kilograms. And I said, "But that's not possible. You've got to become dehydrated during marathon races or during triathlons." And then it slowly became apparent as I looked more carefully at the case studies that all of them had overdrunk and they'd retained the fluid. And in recovery, they passed the fluid out. So we then did a definitive study. Sorry, the next thing that happened was, I think about the 1987 Comrades. I was sleeping here in bed and I woke up midnight. I was phoned by the doctor in charge of the hospital, Gray's Hospital. She was in charge of the casualty. She says, "Doc, I've got 18 athletes here who've come from the Comrades and they've all got low sodiums. What do I do?" I said, "I don't know, but just don't give them any fluid. That's all. Don't give them fluid." And they fortunately all recovered. So then the next year I sent a PhD student to the Comrades and he hospitalized 8 patients who were really sick. They were close to death. 2 of them were close to death. And fortunately, they were brilliantly treated and they recovered. And we could show that all of them had been overhydrated. They'd drunk too much. And so we then had definitive proof already. And we published that in 1991. We had definitive proof that if you tell athletes to overdrink during a race, there are some who are going to come close to death. And so we thought, end of problem. We've solved the problem. But at the same time, I said, there will be a death in North America from a female marathon runner. She will overdrink during the race. She will collapse during the race. She will be hospitalized. She will be treated inappropriately. She'll be given intravenous fluids and she will die. And that happened in 1993, exactly as I predicted. And unfortunately, it went on till about 2007 when finally the drinking guidelines in North America were changed and there was warnings about over drinking. So that book, Waterlogged, reflected, it was published in 2012, so it was a few years after the change, but it reflected the 30 years that I'd studied this problem and tried to convince the authorities around the world that we're forcing over drinking. And it's astonishing how difficult it is, even if you've got the evidence, and even if people are dying, it's astonishing how difficult it is for people who have always said the same thing for them to change their opinions. And we call that cognitive dissonance. They can't accept that maybe what they've done has caused harm. And so that was why I wrote the book. And fortunately, there has been a change, and there have been very few deaths in the last 5 years or so from this condition. But may I add that if we hadn't solved the problem, we could have had literally 10 to hundreds of people dying during the Comrades, because that is the perfect race for the problem to happen. It's so long and there's so much fluid that if people had continued to overdrink, we would have had deaths in the Comrades. Unfortunately, we've never had a death in the Comrades from this condition. And there's in fact only been one death in South Africa from this condition. It was in a military person involved in a very long march, and he overdrank and died. And unfortunately, he wasn't being controlled. There was no one advising him. He was out in the open by himself, and he died as a consequence.
So are there guidelines that we can follow to drink, or do we just drink to thirst when we run? How do we know how much we can drink? And what is
Lisa, isn't it interesting that if I asked you this question, and I'm not being facetious, do you tell your cat when to drink? And the answer is no. But industry told us that humans with this huge brain have to be told when to drink. And the answer is your biology gets you past that. And there's no creature on earth that needs to be told when to drink. We drink in response to thirst. And that's all you need to know. And all the evidence is absolutely that. Although industry still tries to come up with studies showing that if you don't drink and you become slightly dehydrated, your performance is impaired. But all those studies are very suspicious. Where the evidence comes from people who aren't biased, they find no evidence that becoming dehydrated impacts your performance. There is none. As long as you're not thirsty. If you're thirsty, yes, your performance is going to go down. But as long as you're not thirsty, your performance will be fine.
So Dr. Noakes, am I right in saying that we can actually thank you that we have water points on races?
Yes, unfortunately. Of course, I wasn't the only one. It did happen at an international level. But the point is, if I had an option, I would say don't put water stations any closer than 5 kilometers apart. That's all you need. Every 5 kilometers is perfect. And unfortunately, if you have them closer than that, you can potentially have problems. But South Africans, I think, have been realistic, and they've realized that over drinking is not going to make me a champion athlete. And the message about drinking to thirst has fortunately won over.
Professor Noakes, some athletes say that the low-carb, high-fat diet has a negative effect on their training, as it causes them to feel as if they have a lack of energy when they exercise. So are they doing something wrong, or is this diet just maybe not for everyone?
Yeah, I think you're quite right. When you first go through the diet, you definitely do, your performance rate goes down. Paradoxically, mine went up immediately because I was type 2 diabetic. And so that the minute I converted to this diet, I started healing. And so my performance went up immediately. So I had the completely opposite response. And I think it's an important point to make that the low-carb diet really helps people who are what we call insulin-resistant pre-diabetic. And the benefits are so enormous for them that even if their performance goes down a bit, the long-term for their health, it's beneficial. When the clinical trials are done, no one has shown, except for one tiny study by us, unfortunately, And that was only for a week. The study was 1 week long, which is far too short. And yes, we did definitely show that performance went down after 1 week. But even then, I'm not convinced that performance was down. I think that athletes paced themselves slightly differently because the brain was not used to this new information. It didn't feel right. Anyway, the point is that the clinical trials, where they've tried to show that there is an impaired performance, have not achieved that. There's only one, and that unfortunately is the one that everyone reads, and it's by Louise Burke from the Australian Institute of Sport. And so it has a reality or a truth that is more than it deserves for a number of reasons. There are wrong problems with interpreting the data, but other studies show no difference. So we did a study with colleagues in North America where we trained a group on the low carb diet, and then they converted to the high carb diet, and they were randomized so that we did everything correctly. And then they did a 5K time trial in the laboratory. And we found that there was no difference whatsoever with the diet, but they did the diet for 6 weeks, and the performance was just as good on the low carb as on the high carb diet. There was no difference. And these were pretty good athletes. They were running under 20 minutes for 5K. So they're running faster than 4 minutes a K, which puts them better than 88% of all North Americans. So what we were able to show was that 88% of North Americans probably don't need to eat carbs to run fast or as fast as they can. So, but however, I quite agree. There are some people who don't adapt to the diet, and they need to understand that it takes time. You might take 6 weeks, might take 3 months to adapt to the diet. But if you're healthy and you're not insulin resistant, it is a slightly more difficult diet. You have to be a bit more cautious on what you eat. And if you don't get any physical benefit from it, then perhaps it's not worth doing. But I would say that most athletes are eating far too much carbohydrate. They're eating like 400 grams of carbohydrate a day. Whereas we talk about anything from 25 grams to 100, 150 grams. And I can't see any reason why any athlete needs to be above 125 grams, 150 grams a day, which is, most people would say that's a very low carbohydrate restricted diet, but it's not true. It still gives you lots of options. So I think a move to lower carbohydrate diets are healthy, because we encourage real foods, not processed foods. And I do remember I helped one of the South Africa's top triathletes, Ironman triathletes, and he went on and won the Ironman in 2 or 3 years ago. And I looked at his diet when he was training, because he's training 6 hours a day. It was atrocious. I mean, he was eating all this rubbish, the chips and the Cokes and the chocolates, which don't help, and lots of fruit. And that's a disastrous diet. And you don't want to eat that diet when you could be eating eggs and steak and fish and vegetables and cheese and dairy, which would be a much healthier diet for you, because it provides all the nutrients you need. So a lot of people run a lot and they eat food the diet's terrible. And one of the problems is they've got sugar addiction and they don't acknowledge it. And you have to be wary about sugar addiction. So many of those people who struggle on the diet do so because they can't overcome the sugar addiction. And that's what they're actually complaining about. That's why they feel lousy, is because they've lost this addictive chemical in the body.
I can use myself as an example. I started with, we started with the keto diet, which is, I think it's less than 25 grams of carbs a day. And my husband and I started at the beginning of this year. He's a diabetic, and it worked wonderfully for him. His blood glucose levels came down. He lost a lot of weight, and he feels fantastic. But I saw that my performance took a toll. When I'm running, I really, not the times, my running times, but I don't feel like I have energy when I run. So I've started just to up my carbohydrates a bit. I think at the moment I'm probably, I don't measure it, but I think I'm probably at about 150 grams of carbs a day. And I feel much better when I'm running. But what the diet taught me was, like you said, to eat much more healthier, to eat proper foods, to cut out sugar. So overall, even though I'm eating a few more carbohydrates a day, my diet is much more healthier than it was before I started with the keto diet.
Yeah, and realistically, 150 grams is still a low carbohydrate diet compared to what you're normally told to eat. You know, the definition of a low carbohydrate diet in South Africa is 45% carbohydrate, which is like 300 grams, and which is ridiculous. That one of the other points that people need to understand, and we didn't understand it until we studied it, when we put people on low carb diets and study them, what you find is that if you're on a low carb diet, you burn fat all day, obviously, and when you're exercising. But the point is, you burn fat when you're not exercising. If you're eating 500 or 400 grams of carbs a day, the excess, there's so much excess that you don't need, you have to burn carbs. So although you might be burning more carbs during exercise, you also spend the rest of the day trying to get rid of all this carbohydrate. So why do you need to eat 400 grams when actually for optimizing your performance, you only need, let's say, 200 grams. And the other 200 grams is completely wasted. And that's the point that I try to make. So Lisa, you had the perfect example where you cut back, you went too low, and then you moved back and you found the sweet spot for yourself. And as your husband found, your health will be substantially better as a consequence of not having this excess of carbohydrate. And as you said, provided by foods which are not healthy. They're doing all sorts of other things to us which we don't fully understand yet. And you can get away with it. You know, athletes get away with it till they're 25 or 30. But then all of a sudden, it doesn't work anymore. Now, for me, I was profoundly insulin resistant. So my dad died of diabetes. I've got the worst genes for diabetes. And my running started going down already after I had run 2 or 3 Comrades. And already in my late 20s, early 30s, my performance had started going down. And it was because I was just eating too much carbohydrate. And if only I discovered the low carb diet then, my performances would have been kept going much better for much longer. And I would have finished 10 Comrades. Instead, I only ever did 7 because I was just getting too slow and I didn't enjoy it anymore. But I know that because the carbs just didn't suit me, and I didn't understand it, of course.
One of the interesting things that I've seen for myself, because I am a sugar addict, or I was, and trying to just cut on carbs didn't work for me because I literally had to go on cold turkey with some of the sugar and of the carbs. And the interesting thing that I've seen is my cravings has gone the moment that I started introducing more fat into my diet.
Yeah, thank you. You know, that's a really interesting, because this is a sticking point on this diet. There are people who say we should be pushing the proteins and less fat. And biologically, there's a good explanation for that. I think because the fat in your diet does make the fat in your body. Carbohydrates also help. They do produce some of the fats that you store come from carbohydrates. But that's mainly in your liver, which is very dangerous, but we won't address that. But most of the fat that you store is from fat itself in the diet. So logically, if you want to reduce your fat, you must reduce your fat intake. Not because it's calories, but because the fat's going to be stored as fat. The problem is that as soon as you cut fat from your diet, as you know, you get hungry, and so you eat more. And I'm exactly like you, Karina. I only get satiated by eating fat. Protein doesn't do it for me, but for others, protein does it, and the fat doesn't. I mean, I've seen women who've complained that, you know, as soon as they cut dairy, their weight dropped down dramatically. And those people are stimulated. The fat stimulates their appetite. It doesn't do the reverse. So you, Karina, and I are exactly the same, that if we don't eat more fat, we're always hungry, so we'll overeat and we'll tend to put on weight. So it's a very delicate balancing act. And you as an individual, you have to work out what works for you. And if fat satiates you, then you can lose weight. But if fat doesn't satiate you, you're going to put on weight. And so that's where the complexity comes in.
Professor Noakes, we know that nutrition plays a crucial role in our health and weight management. And I think we've actually started talking about that now. Is exercise crucial specifically in weight loss, or is it the role of exercise from a health and well-being perspective more beneficial?
Yeah, thank you, Karina, for that question, because it's terribly important. So there are two models of obesity. And the one that we've been taught for the last 100 years is that it's calories in, calories out, that the calories don't matter. Where they come from doesn't matter. As long as you cut your calories and you increase your energy expenditure, you're going to lose weight. And the point again is the food that you're eating doesn't matter. And what we've learned over the last 100 years is that that has caused an obesity diabetes epidemic. Because what people did, oh, well, the easiest way to cut my calories is cut fat out of the diet. But then the food tastes terrible, so we'll add a bit of sugar, and then we get the sugar addiction, and so then we're never satiated. And the other model is actually, no, the hormones are important, and that the calories you take in, the nature of the calories is very important in whether you lose weight or not. And the more carbohydrates you take in, the less satiated you will be, and the more you'll secrete the hormone insulin. And insulin is like the fat building hormone, and it also prevents you burning fat during exercise. So that's the alternative model. And these two models, the industry is behind this, the calories in, calories out model. So that they push that one. And that's why it's the dominant story taught at all medical schools and at all dietetics and nutrition schools around the world, because they are funded by industry, and industry makes sure that you teach calories in, calories out model. When the hormone story came along, there was all this resistance, as there still is today. And people don't want you to hear the hormone model of obesity. And so, for example, Coca-Cola were caught funding an organization which promoted the idea through a friend of mine who will unfortunately live in infamy. And he would get up in public and say, what you're eating doesn't matter. You've got to run. Problem was he was obese and he'd had a couple of heart attacks. And I mean, I spoke to him at length and tried to explain to him, it's actually the diet that you need to change. But he could never do that because he'd been funded for so long by industry. So that's the problem. So the truth is, and we wrote the article in 2015, saying you can't outrun a bad diet. And it's really interesting that a journalist in America, New York, read that article. And in that article, it referred to some of the influences of the food industry on the scientists. He went and looked at the role of Coca-Cola in promoting this idea that it's calories in, calories out. And that exposed the whole background of what was going on behind the story. So the answer is exercise doesn't work. Exercise just makes you hungry. So you eat more. You can't lose weight with exercise. You've got to address the diet. And the key to weight loss is satiety. You have to find the foods that satiate you and satiate you at a slightly lower energy expenditure. In my own experience, eating a high carbohydrate, high sugar diet, running lots, my calorie intake dropped at least 30%, maybe 40%, the moment I cut out the carbs and started eating a high fat diet. It was instantaneous and I was satiated immediately. It was an astonishing feeling that food no longer dominated my life. I could relegate it, and to think about it once a day or so, I'd think about food. But there was not this every 3 or 4 hours you're worrying about where's your food going to come from.
So are you saying that if your diet is 100% perfect and you still exercise, would that not help you lose more weight? Or would you just get more hungrier and eat more?
No, I think if you're eating the right diet, then your body will decide what body fat content you should be. And I think that, for many people, they may feel that they're still a little fat, but they shouldn't force it. If you're eating the right foods and doing sufficient exercise, you have to just accept this is what I am. Mm. Obviously, if you're a world-class athlete and you're running marathons, you need to be a bit thinner and you might have to restrict your diet at the same time. And that would be fine. But if you restrict too much and lose too much weight, then there are all negative consequences of that as well. Every athlete performs best at a particular weight. And being 2 or 3 kilograms lighter actually doesn't help.
Mm.
And just as being 2 or 3 kilograms heavier doesn't help. There's a sweet spot for everyone. And it's not the lightest weight you could possibly be. It's usually a little bit more than that.
I love that answer because I feel like I'm doing everything, everything perfectly. My diet is, well, 90%, and I'm exercising every day, but I'm not losing any weight. So maybe I should just accept the way that I look like and the fat percentage that I have.
Yeah, that's the reality, that genetics are obviously very, very important. And also there's, it's what your mother ate when she was pregnant with you and your grandmother ate. So you can't be held accountable for what your grandmother ate, because that influences your body weight 2 generations down the way. And so it's better just to accept what you're on. Mm. And remember that being absolutely thin is not helpful. The mortality goes up as you become below a certain weight, and as it goes up before when you go above a certain body mass index. So there is a sweet spot for everyone, and it's not being as thin as the models that we see. They are very, very abnormally light. I mean, they're a very small percentage of the population can ever be that lean, and that is not the ideal.
I'm going to have a chat with my mother.
Exactly, and your grandmother.
My mom apparently loved Milky Bar chocolates, and I'm like, I understand now my sugar addiction.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. You're absolutely not wrong. One of the ladies who is quite heavily overweight, I mean, she's seriously overweight, not a little bit overweight. She said her mother, during the pregnancy, carried a can of Coke around with her, every bottles of Coke with her. Oh, and so she was heavily sugar addicted, and that's impacted on this lady's ability to control her weight.
Sure. So Professor Noakes, at the Tim Noakes Foundation, you have an initiative called Eat Better South Africa. Can you please tell us more about that?
Yeah, Lisa, a lot of people will tell you that this low-carb diet's very expensive. You're eating meat or steak every day, and how can you possibly afford it, and how can the poor people afford it? And the tragedy is that, in my trial, the lady who wrote up the South African Dietary Guidelines essentially admitted that the reason we force the most people in this country to eat cereals and grains is for commercial poverty. That's the key. So it's not that, why don't we address and give the poorest people the best possible diet that they can afford? And that diet is very different from a diet that is based on maize. And so we started working with this and showed that you can provide an individual with very healthy diet for less than 30 Rand a day. Now, of course, that's a lot of money to many people. I understand that. But the reality is it's not 300 Rand a day, as most people would think. A Banting diet, 300 Rand a day. It's not. If you eat eggs and dairy and sardines particularly, and offal and vegetables, you can eat a very healthy diet. And when we have introduced this diet into some of the poorest communities in Cape Town and studied the response of the patients to it, the results are astonishing. They start to get healthier. They become less dependent on their medications. Their blood pressures drop. Their diabetes starts to be better controlled. They don't need to go to hospital all the time to get their medicines. And it's very liberating for them. We've got so many stories. I mean, one that I really appreciated was one lady, when we were with a meeting, she came up and she hugged me and she said, I would not go to the doctors because all my family have diabetes, and I know what happens in diabetes. You're told, well, you're going to die anyway, but here are the pills. And she said, what you've taught us is that that's not the case, that if we follow the diet, we can reverse our diabetes. We don't have to die from it. So now I can go to the hospital and be checked and monitored and helped. And the others said, it's astonishing. I've been on these high blood pressure medications for 20 years. In 3 weeks, my blood pressure is normalized on this diet. Why wasn't I told that 20 years ago? And in these populations, they've now got control. And that's what's really important to them. They're no longer dependent on others for their health.
That is actually so powerful because I think so few of us really want to take the responsibility for our health and our diet. And actually, it's the one thing that can change so many things if we are just willing to do that.
And the irony is, so I lectured to medical doctors in the past, and you get such antagonism when you talk about the low carbohydrate diet and you explain why it works. So when I talk to intelligent people with all this training, so I'm not focused on the intelligent people, I mean the people with all this training, and they can't get it. They don't get it. And we go into these communities and we tell them the story and they say, I got it. I know exactly what you mean. And it works. So let's follow it. Because they don't have any bias. And they're not being controlled by others. And they just want to get better. And what amazes me is that we've had such good results on these diets. And do you think government does anything about it? Whether it's the provincial government or the national government? I mean, the COVID-19 is the classic example. The only way you vaccinate yourself against COVID-19 is to make sure you're metabolically healthy. If you're metabolically healthy, your risk of dying from COVID is almost zero. Almost. I mean, it's low anyway. But if you've not got metabolic syndrome, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, renal conditions, your risk is trivial. But no one says it. You would think people would say, okay, now we've got a chance to get the message out to South Africans. You can't eat junk food and expect to be healthy. If you want to save yourself from worrying about COVID, don't eat junk food. But no one makes that message. Instead, it's we got to wait for the vaccine.
There are probably industries who are keeping that information or trying to keep that information from getting out and reaching people.
Yeah, that's right. That's the tragedy, and that will come apparent. The distortion of science. I mean, truth has just gone out the window with COVID-19. It no longer matters anymore because it's being run by politicians who knows where in the rest of the world, and we're just part of that. But anyway, the point is for the individual, if in 3 weeks you can reduce your risk of dying from COVID by stopping eating junk food, get your glucose under control, get your blood pressure under control, get your inflammation under control, and it makes a huge difference. And so that's a message we really have to get out.
I'm so glad you're answering that because I think that was one of my questions. How long will it take if people start making a change in their diet before they start seeing results? And you've just said 3 weeks. Yeah,
no, definitely. And I mean, it's been established that your blood glucose on admission with COVID-19 is a critical determinant of your outcome. And if it's slightly elevated, your risk is increased. So by extension, we would argue that if you can get your glucose under control before you get the infection, your risk of dying will be dramatically reduced. And let me make this point, which I only really gathered more recently, that if you take a person who's recently diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, recently, not years ago, let's say that they were diagnosed within the last 6 months, you can reverse the diabetes in 1 week. In 1 week, you can get normal glucose control. The disease hasn't been reversed. As soon as they eat the carbs, back comes the diabetes. But it's reversed in the sense that it's now under control. In 1 week, by just having them eat 25 grams carbs a day. That's it. So now let's say that you are just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. That puts you in a high risk for COVID-19 mortality. We put you on a 25-gram carb diet. Within a week, we've normalized your blood glucose. You're normal. You shouldn't have an increased risk from COVID-19. So that's how quickly it should happen.
Sure. That's actually really powerful, and that just puts back the control within each individual. Am I willing to make the changes required to live a healthy life? Professor Noakes, after a lifetime of research and studies, if you look back on your career, is there anything that you would do differently?
Actually, no. You know, I mean, obviously, people would say, oh, but you shouldn't have tweeted that tweet that got you into trouble and got you thrown out of your university and out of your profession. But the reality is, in life, you have a choice. And I've always chased the truth. And that's all I'm interested in. And the consequences of what happens if you expose the truth, there may be discomfort for some years, but in the long term, people will judge you on whether you spoke the truth or not. And I spoke the truth, and that's what I've always written. And so that'll be my legacy ultimately. When people begin to finally accept that type 2 diabetes is reversible and it's caused by this bad diet that we eat, obesity is caused by the bad diet we eat, and that it is one of the major errors in medicine in the last 100 years has been promoting this diet and then covering it up and pretending it was good. So I don't regret those things. I regret that people acted so badly against me. But that is for them they have to live with that. I was just, sorry, and if I hadn't been through this, you know, I wouldn't have learned what Kipling said. He said the 1,000th man or woman. And what he meant was that there are 999 people you don't want to know about, but the 1,000th person is the one you want to know. And I met those 1,000 people, that 1,000th person in my trial. Rocky Ramdas, the doctor and lawyer from Durban, from Pietermaritzburg, an astonishing man. Just, you know, we're brothers now. We bonded so powerfully. I would never have met Rocky but for this trial. Mike van der Nest, the lawyer, senior counsel from Johannesburg, an astonishing man who gave me millions of rands of cover at no cost. And without him and Rocky, I wouldn't have got through this trial. I might not be here today if it wasn't for them. And then, of course, there's my wife and family. So it was tough, but sometimes you have to go through and suffer and to really come out the other side and realize how fortunate you've been and what wonderful people there are. And there may be evil people, but there's some fantastic people, and they're the people you bind to and stick with.
Definitely. I think what people respect, what I respect most about you is simply that you stand up for the truth and that you're not afraid to say, listen, I made a mistake, rip that passage out of the law of running about carbs and throw it in the dustbin. And I really respect that you say, well, listen, I made a mistake and this is the truth. This is what I believe now, and you stand up for that.
Thank you, Liesl. Yeah, that's very kind of you to say. And it's a critical thing we're not taught. We're not taught enough. We're too scared to admit errors.
Professor Noakes, if there is one piece of advice that our listeners can take from you, what is the most important thing that you think that will have the biggest impact on their health and performance, specifically in sport?
Yeah, I think it would be that you understand your mind, try to work on your mind and understand that that's the ultimate determinant. That's point one. But point two, to understand everything in your life impacts on your athletic performance. And you have to get everything right to perform optimally. The other thing I would say is what Bruce Fordyce once said. He said that someone had told him that this person had run the Comrades 10 times. And Bruce said, no, you didn't run it 10 times. You ran it once. You just repeated the same errors 10 times. And so that's what you have to remember. Don't be scared to experiment. But once you find a winning formula, you want to be cautious that you don't change too much. And Bruce was brilliant on that one as well. He said, I used to do the carbo loading diet. And he said, at the time, this is now 30 years ago, he said, I think it helped me. But now he says the opposite. He said, I would have done much better if I'd been on your high-fat diet. But I put him on the low-fat diet, and then I put him on the high-fat diet. So I'm accountable for both. But he said the high-fat diet was much better for him. But he said when we would lecture together, he'd say, I do this carbo loading diet, 3 days before I do this, and 2 days before I do that, and 1 day before I do that. And he said, I won't change it because I'm not sure what's working, but I'm winning the Comrades. And I'm not going to change it, because if I changed one thing, it might be the one thing that really works. And he explains my success. Well, so now we know we would have been more successful if we changed the whole lot of them. But the point is that the great athletes change things, and once they get the winning formula, they won't tweak it too much. They'll just keep changing it. So that's, I would say, don't be scared to experiment, and don't believe everyone. You know, I'm wrong 50% of the time, and you've got to know that. And so every expert is wrong 50% of the time. And you've got to find out what the 50% is that works, that Dr. Noakes doesn't know about, or the other experts.
Dr. Noakes, but you have written so many articles, you have written so many books. If somebody's listening to us, what is that one thing that you will recommend that they go and read?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're talking runners. I think, you know, Still Law of Running is a really good book. And what they need to do is the story of running the Comrades. I think it was 1976 Comrades. That's one of the best pieces I ever wrote. And it was a story of how you feel as you run the race. And I really captured the way I felt when I ran the race. And I think that was some of my best writing. The book's great, but it needs to be revised. So I will get around to it eventually. I've got to revise it. I'm still busy doing other stuff, but eventually I'll get around to it. I think that's one good book. The other good book is The Real Meal Revolution, which sparked all the trouble, and which I literally wrote in 3 weeks. I wrote this chapter, and what was so funny was because there were 4 authors, and that book caused the furor, but all the furor was targeted me, but I was only one of the authors, and all I did was say, here's the science. I didn't say you got to eat this and you got to cook like that. I didn't. That was the other 3, but I was the one who was targeted. But it is an amazing book, and the key to it is the green list, which Sally Ann Creed developed, and that was the low carb foods, and that was genius. That the basis for that book and the basis for the diet is that green list, and that's, if you had to want something that's really important for your health, stick the green list up on your fridge, and you're going to be doing good. You know, the one book we wrote, which didn't get the attention it should have, was for children, a book for diets and children. And let me just see if I've got a copy. Yeah, let me go. Here we go. This is the international edition, or the British edition, and it's an astonishing book. You know, I really put a lot of effort into this science, and there's brilliant recipes. And if you raised your child like that, you'd not have sugar addiction. The child would not have sugar addiction, would never have an obesity problem. But it hasn't been promoted as well as it should have, unfortunately. So
Professor Noakes, let's get that title up here, that people can, that we can just get the title as Superfoods for Super Children.
Yeah, that's the British.
Children, yeah.
That's the British edition. The South African one is
Superheroes, isn't it something like
yeah,
that?
Superfoods for Superheroes, I think it was.
Yeah, we'll put that on our show notes so everyone can have a look. And I think that Jono Proudfoot also released Real Meal Revolution 2.0 that I just
That's
read.
correct.
That's
correct,
a good
yeah.
one as well. Tim, thank you very much for your time. We had such a great time, and we just had Trevor Spencer from the Marathon Training Academy on, and he said that you were one of his favorite interviewees
Good.
over the last 10 years. So, and yeah, we really enjoyed it, and thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure, Lisa. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Karina, for having me. It was a great privilege to be with you both.
Thank you so much. We will put the link for the Tim Noakes Foundation onto the website and the show notes. Is there any other place where people can contact you?
Through the Noakes Foundation is the best. Yeah.
Through the Noakes Foundation. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the time.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.